Black mail order, bride is humiliated in public, until a decorated war hero makes the crowd apologize. What would you do if you were publicly humiliated in front of an entire town, stripped of your dignity by a mob that saw only your skin color? If no one would defend you, no one would stand with you, and the man you traveled thousands of miles to marry was nowhere to be found. In the spring of 1891, Wyoming, where the scars of war still ran deep and prejudice ran deeper, one woman's worst moment would become the catalyst for a decorated soldier's finest hour. Before we discover how a public humiliation became a lesson in courage, and how one man's stand changed an entire town, take a moment to support this channel. If you believe that true heroism means standing up for the defenseless when everyone else turns away, hit that like button, subscribe, and tell us in the comments about a time someone defended you when you needed it most. Now let's journey to Fort Laramie, Wyoming, where honor would be tested and dignity would triumph. The stagecoach pulled into Fort Laramie on a warm April afternoon, and Josephine "Josie" Carter stepped down onto the dusty street with her head high despite the knot of anxiety in her stomach. At 27, she was educated, refined, and utterly alone. She was also black, which made her arrival in this frontier town an event that drew stares from every direction. Josie had come as a mail-order bride for Thomas Mitchell, a shopkeeper who'd written eloquent letters about building a life together in Wyoming territory. His letters had spoken of the West as a place where a person could start fresh, where old prejudices might not hold the same power as back east. Josie, who'd spent years as a governess in Philadelphia watching opportunities close as Reconstruction's promises faded, had wanted desperately to believe him. The man waiting at the stage office was indeed Thomas Mitchell, early 30s, pleasant-faced, well-dressed in a shopkeeper's respectable clothing. But when he saw Josie step down, his welcoming expression froze. "Miss Carter?" His voice was barely above a whisper. "Mr. Mitchell, I'm so pleased to finally meet you in person." Josie extended her hand with the gracious manners she'd learned in the best Philadelphia households. Thomas didn't take her hand. He stared at her, then at the gathering crowd, then back at her. You didn't mention in your letters that you were black?" Josie kept her voice steady despite the ice forming in her chest. "You didn't ask, Mr. Mitchell. Your letters spoke of character and compatibility. I assumed you meant it." "I did, but—" Thomas looked around at the watching faces, and Josie saw him calculating, saw him weighing whatever feelings he might have against social pressure, and she saw him fail the test. "Miss Carter, I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding. I can't possibly what?" Josie's voice was quiet but sharp. "Marry a woman whose letters you claim to admire, honor a commitment you made freely, stand by words you wrote?" "You deceived me," Thomas said, and now his voice was louder, playing to the crowd. "You let me believe you were suitable. No decent man would accept this." The words hit like physical blows, but Josie refused to show it. "I deceived no one, Mr. Mitchell. I told you I was educated, that I'd worked as a governess, that I valued honesty and partnership. Every word was true. What I didn't tell you was the color of my skin because I foolishly believed you when you wrote that character mattered more than convention." "Well, I was wrong," Thomas said flatly. "Some conventions exist for good reason. I'll pay for your return stage fare, Miss Carter, but you cannot stay here. It wouldn't be appropriate." Josie felt the world tilting beneath her feet. She'd spent every dollar traveling here. She had no family, no home to return to, no prospects back east. "Mr. Mitchell, please, I have nowhere else to go." "That's not my problem," Thomas replied. And Josie heard the fear beneath his coldness. He was afraid. Afraid of what his neighbors would think. Afraid of standing out. Afraid of being different. And his fear was going to leave her stranded and destitute. Well, a woman's voice cut through the crowd. A negress thinking she can just waltz into Fort Laramie and marry a white man. The audacity. The speaker was a woman in her 40s, well-dressed, with the bearing of someone accustomed to social authority. Several other women clustered around her, nodding in agreement. She should be run out of town, another voice called. Teaching her kind their place, someone else added. Josie stood frozen as the crowd's energy shifted from curiosity to hostility. More people gathered, drawn by the commotion. She saw anger in some faces, curiosity in others, and worst of all, that peculiar excitement people get when they sense public spectacle and cruelty. "You there, girl?" the first woman said, stepping closer. "What's your name?" "Josephine Carter," Josie replied, keeping her voice level. "And I'm not a girl. I'm a woman of 27 who was invited here by Mr. Mitchell." Invited under false pretenses, clearly. The woman looked Josie up and down with open disdain. "Look at you, putting on airs with your fine dress and educated speech, trying to be what you're not, trying to rise above your station." "My station," Josie said quietly, "is that of a free woman, educated and employed, corresponding honestly with a man who claimed to value those qualities. If anyone is at fault here, it's Mr. Mitchell for breaking his word." "How dare you?" The woman's face flushed. "You deceived him. You trapped him with your letters, and now you're trying to force yourself into decent society where you don't belong." The crowd murmured agreement. Josie felt the situation spiraling out of control. This wasn't just rejection. This was becoming a mob. "I think," the woman continued, her voice growing louder for the crowd's benefit, "that this negress needs to learn some humility, needs to understand that Fort Laramie is a respectable town that won't tolerate her kind, trying to infiltrate our society." "What are you suggesting, Mrs. Blackwood?" someone called from the crowd. "I'm suggesting that before we put her back on that stage, she apologize. Apologize for her deception, for her presumption, for daring to think she could marry a white man and live among decent people as if she were one of us." "I've done nothing that requires apology," Josie said, her voice shaking now despite her efforts to control it. "I won't apologize for existing, for being educated, or for believing a man's written word." "Then we'll make you apologize," Mrs. Blackwood said coldly. She turned to the crowd. "Who's with me? Who thinks this uppity negress needs to be taught her place?" The response was a roar of approval. Josie backed toward the stage office, but hands grabbed her arms. Not violently, but firmly. Men and women determined to enforce their will. "On your knees," Mrs. Blackwood commanded. "You'll apologize on your knees for your presumption." "No!" Josie struggled against the hands holding her, terror and fury warring in her chest. "I won't." Someone kicked the back of her knees, forcing her down onto the dusty street. Josie's elegant traveling dress, chosen so carefully to make a good first impression, hit the dirt. Tears of humiliation burned her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "Now," Mrs. Blackwood said, standing over her, "apologize. Say I'm sorry for trying to rise above my station. I'm sorry for deceiving Mr. Mitchell. I'm sorry for thinking I could be the equal of white people." The crowd was silent now, waiting. Josie looked up at their faces, some eager, some uncomfortable, none willing to intervene. She looked at Thomas Mitchell, who was pale and sick-looking but still silent, and she made her choice. "No." The word hung in the air. "What did you say?" Mrs. Blackwood's voice was dangerous. "I said no," Josie repeated louder now. "I will not apologize for being born black. I will not apologize for being educated. I will not apologize for believing a man who claimed to value character over color. And I will not grovel in the dirt for the entertainment of a mob too cowardly to face their own prejudice." The slap came hard across her face, snapping her head to the side. Josie tasted blood. The crowd gasped, some in shock, some in approval. "You insolent," Mrs. Blackwood raised her hand again. "That's enough." The voice cut through the scene like a blade, deep, authoritative, absolutely commanding. The crowd turned, and Josie, still on her knees in the dirt, looked up to see a man striding through the parting mob. He was tall, broad-shouldered, probably in his early 40s, with the bearing of someone accustomed to command. He wore civilian clothes, but something about his posture screamed military. His face was weathered, with a long scar running down his left cheek, a badge of hard service. And his eyes, when they swept across the crowd, were cold as winter ice. "Captain Thornton," someone in the crowd said nervously. The man, Thornton, stopped in the center of the circle that had formed around Josie. He looked at her, still kneeling in the dirt with blood on her lip, and something flickered in his expression. Then he turned to face Mrs. Blackwood. "What exactly is happening here, Constance?" "Captain, this is none of your concern," Mrs. Blackwood replied, though her voice had lost some of its certainty. "This is a matter of maintaining social standards." "I'll ask again," Thornton interrupted, his voice quiet, but somehow more threatening than if he'd shouted. "What is happening here?" "This negress," Mrs. Blackwood gestured at Josie with contempt, "came here under false pretenses to trap Mr. Mitchell into marriage. We were simply teaching her." "Her name," Thornton said coldly, "is Miss Carter, and you will use it. Now someone explain to me why a woman is on her knees in the street with blood on her face while a crowd watches. And choose your words carefully, because I saw that slap from across the street." The crowd shuffled nervously. No one seemed eager to speak. Thornton turned to Josie. "Miss Carter, are you injured?" "Only my dignity, sir," Josie managed, hating that her voice shook. "Stand up," Thornton said gently. When Josie struggled with her skirts, he extended his hand. Josie hesitated. Taking help from this stranger would bind her to him somehow, but she was still trapped by the crowd, and he was the only one offering assistance. She took his hand. It was calloused, strong, and utterly steady. He helped her to her feet with careful courtesy, then positioned himself slightly between her and the crowd. "Now," Thornton said, addressing the mob, "I want a clear explanation. Who struck Miss Carter?" "I did," Mrs. Blackwood said, lifting her chin defiantly. "She was insolent and needed correction." "Correction?" Thornton's voice was flat. "You struck an unarmed woman half your size for speaking her mind, and you call that correction? She's a negress who—" "She's a human being," Thornton interrupted, "who appears to have committed no crime other than responding to an advertisement and having the misfortune to arrive in a town full of cowards." The crowd erupted in protests, but Thornton's voice cut through them like thunder. "Quiet!" The military command in that single word was undeniable. The crowd fell silent. "I am Captain James Thornton," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the gathering. "Some of you know me. Some of you know what I did in the war. I commanded the 3rd Wyoming Volunteers. I fought at Antietam, at Gettysburg, at Petersburg. I watched men die, black and white together, fighting for the principle that all men are created equal. I came home with these scars and this medal." He tapped his chest where a decoration was visible beneath his vest. "Believing we'd won something worth having." He paused, letting his gaze sweep across the crowd. "I was wrong, because here I stand in Fort Laramie, Wyoming, watching supposedly decent people humiliate an innocent woman for the crime of being born black, and daring to believe she deserved respect." "Captain Thornton," a man in the crowd spoke up, "you don't understand the situation." "I understand perfectly," Thornton replied. "Miss Carter corresponded with Mr. Mitchell. He invited her here. She arrived in good faith, and rather than honor his commitment or at least decline it with decency, Mitchell here," he gestured at Thomas, who flinched, "rejected her publicly and allowed his neighbors to assault her. Is that an accurate summary, Miss Carter?" "Yes, sir," Josie said quietly. Thornton turned back to the crowd. "So we have breach of promise, public humiliation, and assault. And you're all standing here as if this is somehow acceptable, as if this woman's skin color justifies treating her worse than you'd treat a dog." "She shouldn't have come here," someone called out. "She was invited." Thornton's voice cracked like a whip. "Mitchell sent letters, made promises," she responded honestly. "The fault here is entirely his for lacking the courage of his supposed convictions." He stepped forward, and the crowd instinctively backed up. "Here's what's going to happen. Each of you who participated in this, Mrs. Blackwood, you who struck her, and everyone who held her down or demanded she apologize, you're going to apologize. Sincerely, And then you're going to disperse and think long and hard about what kind of people you've become. You can't make us apologize to a—" Mrs. Blackwood started. "Can I?" Thornton's smile was cold. "Mrs. Blackwood, your husband's dry goods business supplies half the ranches in this territory. How many of those ranchers served under me? How many owe me their lives? What do you think happens to your business if I suggest they shop elsewhere?" Mrs. Blackwood paled. Thornton turned to others in the crowd. "Jim Patterson, you owe me $300 from poker. Want me to call that debt? Susan Grant, your son wants a recommendation for West Point. Think he'll get it? Charles Whitmore, remember, who testified at your land claim hearing?" The crowd was silent now, their righteous anger replaced by calculation and fear. "I'm not asking you to accept Miss Carter," Thornton said, his voice softer but no less forceful. "I'm not asking you to invite her to tea. I'm asking you to acknowledge that what happened here was wrong. That humiliating someone, striking them, forcing them to their knees, that's wrong regardless of their color. And I'm asking you to have the basic human decency to apologize for it." The silence stretched. Then, surprisingly, a voice spoke from the back of the crowd. "Captain's right." An old man pushed forward, grizzled, missing an arm, clearly a veteran himself. "I was at Shiloh. Saw men die in the mud, crying for their mothers, black and white, bleeding the same color red. Captain Thornton's right. What we did here today was shameful. I'm sorry, miss, I didn't lay hands on you, but I stood by and watched. And that's its own kind of wrong." The old soldier's words broke the dam. Another voice joined, then another. "I'm sorry, Miss Carter. Shouldn't have done it. Got caught up in the moment, wasn't right." Not everyone apologized. Some people melted away into the crowd, unwilling to admit fault. But enough spoke that the tenor of the gathering changed from hostile mob to ashamed individuals. Finally, Mrs. Blackwood spoke, her voice tight. "Miss Carter, I apologize for striking you. It was beneath me." Josie looked at her, this woman who'd orchestrated her humiliation, and made a choice. "I accept your apology, Mrs. Blackwood, though I hope you'll remember this moment the next time you're tempted to judge someone based on their appearance, rather than their character." Mrs. Blackwood flushed but nodded curtly before walking away, her supporters scattering. As the crowd dispersed, Josie found herself standing in the street with Captain Thornton, her rescuer and defender. She looked up at him, this scarred stranger who'd stood up for her when no one else would. "Thank you," she said quietly. "You didn't have to do that." "Yes, I did," Thornton replied, "because if I didn't, I'd be no better than them. And I didn't survive 3 years of war just to come home and watch people torture each other for entertainment." "Still," Josie insisted, "you put yourself at risk for me, called in favors, made threats. Why?" Thornton was quiet for a moment, his eyes distant. "Because I'm tired of watching good people suffer while cowards hide behind convention. Because I've seen too much death to tolerate cruelty from the living. And because, Miss Carter, someone needed to do the right thing, and it might as well be me." He looked down at her, and Josie saw past the scars and the hardness to something gentler beneath. "What will you do now? You clearly can't stay with Mitchell." Josie felt despair wash over her again. The adrenaline of the confrontation was fading, leaving her exhausted and terrified. "I don't know. I have no money for stage fare back, no place to go if I could afford it, no prospects, no friends, nothing." "You have me," Thornton said quietly. Josie looked up sharply. "What?" "I mean as a friend and ally," Thornton clarified quickly. "Miss Carter, I have a ranch about 5 miles from here. It's not much. I run it alone since my housekeeper quit last month. But I have a spare bedroom, and I could use help with the books and correspondence. I'm not much for reading or writing. If you're willing, you could work for me in exchange for room and board while you figure out your next steps." "Work for you?" Josie studied his face, looking for the trap, the catch, the ulterior motive. "As an employee," Thornton emphasized, "with a locked door on your room and complete respect for your privacy. I'm offering you work and safety, Miss Carter. Nothing more unless you choose otherwise." I'm many things, but I'm not a man who takes advantage of desperation. Josie wanted to refuse. Her pride demanded it. But her practicality was stronger. She had no other options, and this man had just proven himself willing to stand against an entire town for her. That had to count for something. I accept, she said, on a trial basis, 1 month. If it doesn't work out, you'll help me find other employment or pay my passage to somewhere I can start fresh. Agreed. Thornton extended his hand, and they shook on it formally. His grip was firm but careful, as if he was conscious of his own strength. I'll get your trunk, Thornton said, moving toward the stage office. Josie stood alone in the street for a moment, looking at the place where she'd been forced to her knees, where she'd been slapped and humiliated and made to feel less than human. And she made herself a promise. She would never kneel again, never apologize for existing, never let fear make her small. The ride to Thornton's ranch was quiet. Josie sat in the wagon beside him, acutely aware of his presence, of the impropriety of traveling alone with a man she'd just met, of how different this day had turned out from what she'd imagined. You're wondering if you made a mistake, Thornton said suddenly, coming with me. Josie considered lying, then decided this man deserved honesty. I'm wondering if I've traded one dangerous situation for another. Fair concern. Thornton kept his eyes on the road. Miss Carter, I'm going to tell you some things about myself so you can judge the risk. I'm 43 years old. I was married once. She died of fever 10 years ago. No children. I served in the Union Army from 61 to 65, mostly with colored troops toward the end. I saw things in that war that changed how I see the world. I came back here to my family's ranch and I've been alone since. I'm not a patient man. I have a temper I work hard to control, and I don't suffer fools. But I've never raised a hand to anyone who didn't deserve it, and I've never forced myself on any woman. That's who I am. Josie absorbed this. Why did you serve with colored troops? Because the Army needed officers willing to command them, and I was tired of watching brave men be wasted by incompetent commanders who saw them as expendable. Thornton's jaw tightened. I fought alongside men who'd been slaves, who'd never been taught to read, who had every reason to hate this country. And they fought harder, braver, more honorably than most white soldiers I knew. They changed me, Miss Carter, made me see that the color of a man's skin tells you nothing about the content of his character. And yet you live in a town that just humiliated me for mine, Josie pointed out. I live 5 miles from that town and visit as little as possible, Thornton corrected. I have no use for Fort Laramie society. Most of them are small-minded bigots who mistake convention for morality. I tolerate them because I have to conduct business, but I don't call them friends. Then why defend me? Why not just walk away? Thornton was quiet for so long Josie thought he wouldn't answer. Then, because I knew one of those soldiers, Private Samuel Johnson, best man I ever served with. He saved my life at Petersburg, took a bullet that was meant for me. And when we got back to camp, a white officer from another regiment saw him helping me to the medical tent and called him a presumptuous nightmare, said he should know better than to touch a white officer. Samuel just smiled and said, "Yes, sir," and walked away. Never defended himself, never pointed out that he'd just saved my life, and I said nothing. I was too tired, too hurt, too much of a coward to stand up for him. His hands tightened on the reins. Samuel died 3 weeks later in another battle, and I've regretted my silence every day since. So when I saw you on your knees in the street, refusing to apologize for existing, I heard Samuel's voice in my head, and I decided I was done being silent. Josie felt tears sting her eyes, not for herself this time, but for this complicated, damaged man beside her who carried his ghosts so visibly. Samuel would be proud of you. Maybe, Thornton said, or maybe he'd say I'm 15 years too late. Either way, Miss Carter, you deserved someone to stand up for you today. I'm glad it was me. They rode the rest of the way in companionable silence, and when they reached the ranch, a modest but well-maintained spread with a timber house and several outbuildings, Josie felt the first real hope since arriving in Wyoming. Over the following weeks, Josie established her place at the Thornton Ranch. She managed the household accounts, handled correspondence, organized the chaos of his paperwork, and even helped with some of the lighter ranch work. Thornton was a fair employer, demanding but respectful, never crossing boundaries, always treating her as an intelligent equal. And slowly, carefully, they became friends. Thornton would tell stories of the war, not the glory parts, but the human moments. The soldier who'd sung spirituals so beautifully the whole camp would go quiet to listen. The sergeant who'd taught him that courage came in many forms, the moments of grace in the midst of horror. Josie shared her own stories. Growing up in Philadelphia, the families she'd worked for, the casual cruelties of being black and educated in a society that wanted her to be neither. The dreams she'd had, and the ways they'd been systematically destroyed. "Why did you answer Mitchell's advertisement?" Thornton asked one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. "Because I was tired," Josie admitted. "Tired of fighting for scraps, tired of being invisible or threatening depending on the day, tired of being alone. Mitchell's letters made me feel seen for the first time in years. He wrote about wanting a partner with a mind, someone who could think and reason. I thought maybe the West would be different. That distance from established society might mean freedom from its prejudices. And instead you found the same hatred, just in a new location." "Yes, which makes me wonder if there's anywhere I can actually belong." Josie looked at him. "How do you do it? How do you live knowing the world is this cruel?" "By trying to make my corner of it less cruel," Thornton replied. "I can't change Fort Laramie, can't make people stop being bigots. But I can refuse to participate in their hatred. I can use what power I have to protect people they'd hurt. And sometimes that's enough." "Is it?" Josie asked. "Enough, I mean." "It has to be," Thornton said, "because the alternative is despair, and I didn't survive the war just to give up on everything it was supposed to mean." Their friendship continued to deepen. Josie found herself looking forward to their evening conversations, to the way Thornton's face would soften when he smiled, to the feeling of safety she'd never expected to find, and she saw how he looked at her, with respect, yes, but also with something deeper, something he was clearly keeping carefully controlled. 2 months after Josie's arrival, a letter came from Thomas Mitchell. It was addressed to Captain Thornton but clearly intended for Josie. "Captain Thornton, I am writing to inform you that I am prepared to honor my original commitment to Miss Carter. The scandal of that day has died down, and I believe we could make a suitable match. Please convey to Miss Carter that I am willing to marry her if she will agree to certain conditions regarding public behavior and social limitations. I trust this resolves the situation satisfactorily. Regards." Thomas Mitchell. Josie read the letter with something between fury and disbelief. He actually thinks I'd marry him now, after what he did, and certain conditions. He wants me to marry him but hide, to make myself small and acceptable. "The man's a fool," Thornton said flatly. "But Josie, I have to ask, is this what you want? Marriage, stability, the life you came here seeking?" "Not like this," Josie said immediately. "Not with a man who abandoned me to a mob. Not with conditions and limitations. I'd rather—" She trailed off, suddenly aware of what she'd been about to say. "Rather what?" Thornton prompted gently. "I'd rather have what we have now," Josie admitted. "Partnership, respect, friendship with someone who actually values me." Thornton was very still. "Josie, Miss Carter, I need to tell you something." "What?" "I'm in love with you." The words hung in the air between them. Josie's breath caught. "I know I have no right," Thornton continued, his voice rough. "I'm too old for you, too damaged, too scarred inside and out. And I know society would condemn it. But Josie, over these past months, you've become the best part of my days. Your intelligence, your courage, your refusal to be diminished, you're extraordinary. And I love you. Not because I pity you or want to save you, but because you're the strongest, most remarkable person I've ever known." Josie felt tears on her cheeks. "James, you don't have to say anything," Thornton said quickly. "I know the complications. I know what it would mean for you to marry a white man here. I know the prejudice you'd still face. I couldn't let you consider Mitchell without you knowing you have another choice. That if you want it, if you choose it freely, I would be honored to be your husband." "I thought you'd never ask," Josie said, and she was smiling through her tears. "James, I love you too. You're the first person who's ever made me feel truly safe, who's ever stood up for me without needing credit or praise, who values my mind as much as my heart. Yes, I'll marry you. Not because I need rescue or security, but because I choose you." They married quietly 3 weeks later in a ceremony performed by the circuit minister with the old veteran from town, the first to apologize, and his wife as witnesses. The town of Fort Laramie talked, of course. Some were scandalized, some were disgusted, but none dared challenge Captain Thornton openly, not after what had happened in the street that day. And gradually, very gradually, Josie Thornton became a presence in Fort Laramie. She was never fully accepted by society. Mrs. Blackwood and her circle never quite forgave her for existing, but she was respected. She opened a small school for children whose parents couldn't afford formal education. She helped her husband expand his ranch. She became known not as the black woman, but as Mrs. Thornton, the captain's wife. It wasn't easy. There were still insults, still prejudice, still moments when Josie felt the weight of being different in a hostile world. But she never had to face it alone. James stood beside her, using his influence and his reputation to shield her when he could, standing with her when he couldn't. And sometimes, late at night, Josie would think about that day in the street, the worst moment of her life, when she'd been forced to her knees and made to feel worthless. She'd think about how she'd refused to apologize, refused to accept their judgment, refused to be broken. And then James would pull her close, and she'd remember that the worst day of her life had also been the beginning of the best thing that ever happened to her, because it had brought her a man who understood that courage meant standing up when everyone else sat down. That love meant choosing someone despite the world's disapproval. That honor required action, not just words. Years later, when people would ask Josie about that day, she'd tell them the truth. She'd been humiliated, struck, forced to her knees by a mob. But she'd refused to apologize for being herself, and a decorated war hero had made them all apologize instead. It wasn't romantic, she'd say. It was terrifying and painful and showed humanity at its worst. But it also showed one man at his best, and that made all the difference. If this story of public humiliation transformed into triumph, of one voice against many, and of love that refused to bow to prejudice touched your heart, please show your support by liking this video and subscribing to our channel. Tell us in the comments about a time someone stood up for you when you needed it most, or about having the courage to defend someone else. Check out our playlist for more stories of courage, dignity, and love that defies convention. Your support helps us share these powerful tales of people who refuse to let cruelty win. Thank you for watching, and remember, true courage is standing up for others when it costs you something. True love is choosing someone despite the world's disapproval. And true character is revealed not in comfort but in crisis, when standing up is hardest and most necessary.